So, welcome back from the Godly Play. That gives you a very clear overview of what the Christian year looks like. But of course, it's not that simple. There are all kinds of factors that complicate that lovely, clear calendar picture. And some of them are caused by factors inside the church and some are caused by factors outside the church. One of the biggest factors complicating the Christian year is patterns of church attendance. The calendar of the Christian year, as I showed it to you in the Godly Play, is based on the assumption that basically people are going to be in church every Sunday. 52 shots a year, plus the odd extra things that don't fall on a Sunday, like Ascension Day, Good Friday, what have you. For a good keeping of the Christian year in that model, you need to assume that level and that pattern of attendance. But of course, that level and that pattern of attendance doesn't happen. More often than not, families are moving to monthly church attendance. What happens when you only get 12 slots in the Christian year? How do you reflect the same balance of the year in a much shorter time? Very often people won't turn out for weekday things. So do you have to shift things like Ascension Day to a Sunday? Well, that's possible. But how do you do the whole of Holy Week on just Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday? And should you? And if some of your congregation are going to turn out in the week and some don't, how do you balance that in what you offer in church? Then, of course, the places that are best formed to keep the church year are church schools, because they have a daily pattern of worship and the church's year really helps for them sometimes, except the school year means that they're always at home at Christmas and Easter. So of course the celebrations of Christmas have to move into Advent to be done by Christmas so that you're not missing Christmas. But then what happens with Easter? It all gets very complicated sometimes and very hard to judge. Then another factor that complicates the Christian year beautifully is saints' days. From very early in the church, people have wanted to keep an annual remembrance of certain important people in church's history. Important days when God acted in the lives of people like us. Important times, important people to remember for this community. But there are now so many saints' days that practically every day of the church's year is a saint's day of someone or other. And if you kept them all as saints' days, you'd lose the big pattern that's based around the life of Jesus and have lots of tiny little patterns based around the life of someone or other. So how do you balance keeping the big things and the small things? Who takes precedence? And is that precedence always the same? In 2017, that came to a head in my cathedral in St. David's Day because Ash Wednesday fell on St. David's Day. How were they going to balance the celebration of the patron saint of Wales in his own cathedral with Ash Wednesday and the start of Lent? You can look online and find how they did it and find all the outrage it caused if you wanted a particular instance. There's going to be another one coming up in 2018, I believe, when Ash Wednesday again coincides with Valentine's Day. What's going to happen then? So that's another thing that complicates the run of the church's year. Third factor for complication is good cause Sundays. Certain Sundays of the year we're asked to keep as Education Sunday or Homelessness Sunday or Refugees Sunday or Christian Aid Sunday, or a Sunday of Prayer for Christian Unity, or 2020 Vision Sunday. And all of these are worthy causes, but they break into the cycle of keeping the whole year. And the balance between the worthy causes and keeping up the momentum of the Christian year can be very difficult. And the Church in Wales doesn't always help by putting things like 2020 Vision Sunday on Trinity Sunday, when the two necessarily don't fit very happily together. Another thing that breaks the cycle of the church's year is the unpredictable. And you can always predict that there will be something unpredictable. There may be a terrorist atrocity on a Sunday just before the readings are all about joy or happiness, so that the mood of the church in that place will be very different from the mood that the church year is trying to compel. Now, I think part of the Christian life is about living with tensions like that, but it does make it complicated and make it difficult and make hard choices about how much you give to the local and how much you give to the universal. Then let's throw in the fact that society has a ritual year, a secular ritual year as well. If you want to study that, the book is Ronald Hutton's The Stations of the Sun, an old one but a goodie. Ronald Hutton is not a Christian. In fact, he's a modern British pagan. But his book, The Stations of the Sun, really does take you through the ritual year as it is celebrated in the whole of British society, not just church society. And the ritual year does impinge on the church's year quite badly, or quite well, depending on which side you take in the debate. Let's look at Advent. It's meant to be a time of preparation for Christmas, but the secular world has already started celebrating Christmas, and the only places that aren't celebrating Christmas are the churches, which seems a bit strange to someone coming in and the vicar saying you can't sing Christmas carols till it's Christmas, and who puts up the Christmas tree and when, causes debates and bad feeling in practically every parish. In parish where I was curate, there was an elderly clergyman who kept the tradition of preaching the four last things, death, judgment, heaven and hell, for the 4 Sundays of Advent. So hell would nicely coincide every year with the Sunday school nativity play. Another factor that complicates the Christian year is multiculturalism. That's why I put up the picture from you. We're not the only ones celebrating a ritual year. And the fact that people around us may be celebrating Hanukkah or Diwali or Eid or one of the pagan festivals very close to the Christian festival, that can have interesting resonances in a multicultural city. Some of them good, some of them bad, even in a multicultural village. I hope you like the picture from Sheffield, which says Merry Christmas, Sheffield. It also has Happy Hanukkah at the bottom, but you can't really see that. What you can see is the Jewish menorah under the words Merry Christmas. It's a way of insulting everyone without meaning to. And then there's the worldwide church. Our church's year is set up with the assumptions of the Northern Hemisphere. We celebrate Christmas at the darkest time of the year and the coming of the light in the darkness. We celebrate Easter in the spring when all around us the world is experiencing resurrection, new birth, new life out of winter. Imagine what happens in the Southern Hemisphere when suddenly you're celebrating Christmas at the lightest time of the year and you're celebrating Easter at the time when everything's dying back. It's no surprise that the greatest push for a new season, a creation season, comes from the Southern Hemisphere, comes from Australia and New Zealand, because they're experiencing spring. And so they want to put it in at that moment. So maybe one of the questions you want to ask is, how much is your keeping of the year about theology and how much is it just about responding to the rhythms of the earth? And if God created the world and everything in it, is there a problem with that? But equally then, should our friends in Australia and New Zealand or in South Africa then celebrate their Easter in our October? Wonder what you think about that. Let's just, before we finish this section, just broaden it out by looking at the ritual year in 2 other religions. I've chosen Judaism because the Jewish ritual calendar underlies the Christian ritual calendar. And then I've chosen modern British paganism because it's very much a thought through religion from a 20th century point of view, and that will give you just a different perspective. So let's look at the Jewish ritual calendar. The Jewish ritual year is based on the moon. All of the months are a lunar cycle, not a solar cycle, which means that once in a while an extra month has to be shoved in to try and stop the seasons moving in the year so that the spring festivals always happen in the spring. A new moon, a year based around the moon makes a lot of sense in a place where you can see the moon and the stars well, because it's easier to mark a month. If the 14th of the month is always full moon, you can see that. You can know it very easily. And the moon cycles do respond to the rhythms of the human body, the rhythms of the tide. So the lunar cycle makes a lot of sense for basing your ritual year around. But as I say, it causes problems when it pulls against the solar year. And we see that in the fact that Easter, which is set by the Jewish calendar, which is a lunar calendar, moves, and Christmas, which is set by a solar calendar, doesn't move. So, in the autumn, you have the Feast of the New Year, which celebrates creation, Rosh Hashanah in Judaism. Then you have a Day of Atonement, a day and a time for making peace with other people and with God. And then you have the Feast of Booths, Sukkot, and people move out and leave in booths built in their gardens to remember the time when people lived in the desert, when they travelled. But it's also a harvest festival, so I think in rural Jewish communities there was a lot of harvest celebration that got happening in those booths, which is the background possibly of the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospels. And then as you move into winter, you have Hanukkah, which is a festival of lights. It remembers the Maccabean revolt, which is the stories told in the Apocrypha, of how Judaism was almost destroyed, of how the temple was destroyed, of the lamp that marked the presence of God was nearly put out. And there was only one flask of oil left, and it was going to take a long time, 9 days to get more oil, but still, miraculously, the lamp kept burning. God's presence didn't leave his people even in the darkest of times. So that festival of lights is marked usually in December in our terms. And there are all kinds of interesting crossovers between the keeping of Hanukkah and the keeping of Christmas. Then into the spring you get Purim. Purim remembers the story of Esther, and Purim is a great celebration. There are Purim plays and people boo the baddie and cheer for the hero, and they have rattles and they have cakes, and it's a great shindig, something to cheer you up in late February. But again, another story about how the people of God were nearly wiped out, but how they survived. And then probably the most important festival comes at full moon in the spring month of Nisan, and it's Pesach, Passover. And Passover remembers the story of the Exodus, how God led the people through the waters to freedom, and it celebrates that, and families are commanded to keep this festival with unleavened bread, with a special meal, with a time of great rejoicing, and to tell their children over and over these stories, because that's the foundational story for their identity as the people of God. And then 6 weeks after Passover is the Festival of Weeks. We know it as Pentecost, but it's a first fruits celebration. It's the first of the harvest comes there, the sign of new growth, but it also remembers the giving of the law. So you rejoice in the giving of the law. And actually, strangely enough, you do it by getting very, very drunk, if you're a good Jewish person. So that's how the ritual year looks in Judaism. What I think I want you to take away from it is how important the stories are behind this. The stories of the Old Testament, how they're brought to life again in the yearly keeping of these, and how they're passed on to the next generation, not just through the words read in the synagogue liturgy, but also by plays, by rattles, by food, by questions, by customs, by things that happen in the home as much as things that happen in synagogue. And how it affects what you eat and what you dress and what you think about and what you do, the wholeness of life, not just a tiny box of it that you might call spiritual. Let's give you a contrast, and let's look at the ritual year of modern British paganism. This isn't really the place to go into a background to modern British paganism, but if you read Ronald Hutton's other book that's very famous, The Triumph of the Moon, that'll give you a history of it and an introduction to it. Hutton in that talks about it as being a British religion, a constructed religion, in some ways a reaction to all the pressures of 19th and 20th century life. And it's developed a very strong solar calendar. It's based around the two times when the sun appears to stop still, the solstices, midwinter and midsummer, and then the equinoxes when night and day are equally balanced, in the spring and in the autumn. So Yule is the midwinter festival, Ostara is the spring equinox, midsummer is midsummer, and Mabon is the autumn equinox. Then spacing those are 4 festivals that come from an ancient Irish calendar and the agricultural festivals. Imbolc at the beginning of February is the time when lambing begins. It's the start of when you really see spring starting to happen. Beltane is the start of where you really see summer happening. Lunasa, the 1st of August. Well, it felt to me this August that I'm starting to see autumn beginning in August, but it's that change of season again. And Samhain, unless I know it says Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain or Samhain, is Halloween, which in Wales is Nos Calan Gaeaf, the first day of winter. So you can see that it's a seasonal calendar, and the story underlying it is the story of the changing of the seasons. And also in some ways it's a post-Christian or an anti-Christian calendar, in that they are keeping a midwinter festival that they're deliberately calling it Yule rather than Christmas. They're keeping an Easter festival, but they're calling it Ostara rather than Easter. The other thing, of course, is it works out lovely that you have a festival almost every 6 to 8 weeks that you can plan like clockwork. So that probably helps too. So that just gives you another one. What I want you to take away from that is just think about how much the changing of seasons underlies a lot of the keeping of the Christian calendar, and is that a problem for you or is it not a problem for you? But what would happen if you had a calendar of a ritual year that was only about the changing of the seasons and the stories underlying those, and wasn't, like the Jewish calendar, deeply about the stories of the Bible? There. That's given you a few things to get started with, and in the next section I want to give you some key concepts to work with as well.